Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bitesize Ecclesiastical Law. We are going to be discussing why ecclesiastical law this evening. Just a reminder before we get going that in this YouTube series, we're not giving legal advice, but that's probably very apparent with this evening's topic as we're discussing why we have ecclesiastical law in the first place. I'm Russell Dewhurst. If you don't know me, I'm the Ecclesiastical Law Society Communications Officer, and I'm talking to Moira Astin. Moira, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Moira Astin. I'm the Archdeacon of Reigate, although you catch me in my civvies this evening, just to prove that clergy don't always wear dog collars. In the past, I was on General Synod for 12 years, and so was involved in helping to write some of the law of the Church of England. I've been a member of the Clergy Discipline Commission for a long time, and I have also been a long-term ecumenical officer for 3 different dioceses. And that's really where I got into ecclesiastical law, because although some ecumenical officers try and run away from it, I decided the best thing was to find out what I ought to know and where there were going to be problems in relationships with other denominations. And I'm now the chair of the Ecclesiastical Law Society Education Committee and also one of the trustees.
Brilliant. Thanks, Moira. So in our future episodes of Bitesize Ecclesiastical Law, we'll probably zoom into some of those areas you touched on there, clergy discipline, ecumenism, and so on. But today we decided for the second subject, we'd look at why ecclesiastical law, didn't we?
We did. It's a sign, kind of completely different from many of our other topics, which are much more detailed. But last month we thought about what is ecclesiastical law. We saw its variety. We particularly saw that because the Church of England is established, our law is part of the law of the land. But that assumes the answer to the question of, well, why have law at all?
Absolutely. And that's probably the question to start with, Moira. So why do we have law?
So there's historically, and I do mean historically, there's a profound theological reason for having law. If you go back into the Judeo-Christian tradition, you go all the way back to Abraham. And God set apart Abraham. We had a relationship of God to one human being or God to one human being and his family. It was a relationship of trust. And it was a small enough group that law didn't really come into it. God speaking directly to Abraham, and he led his clan. And this is still the underlying theology of relationship with God in the Old Testament and into the New. The people, the family of God, relating to God, and certainly in the Old Testament through particular mediators. If you fast forward a few centuries to when the people of Israel are being brought out of Egypt, they're led by Moses, who is being the mediator and has this direct relationship with God. But at that point, God marks them out as his holy people by giving them the law. It's a gift to his people. It's a way in which their relationship will be marked with God, no longer just through them having to have a leader who is a mediator who then has to explain everything to everybody all the time, but they will have the law as part of who they are as a people. So from the beginning, a people are known by the law that they have been given and they live under.
I think that's such a powerful point, Moira, and that the book of Exodus there, it's that story of the people going from slavery to freedom, and as part of being given freedom, they're given law. And I think it's so powerful. It shows those two things are not pulling in different directions, law and freedom, but the one assists the other. Absolutely. But people may be thinking we're talking here just all about the Old Testament. Christians are living under a new covenant. So how can you bring this discussion of law into the New Testament?
Indeed, and in a sense, you can bring this same theme across of a people with a mediator. It's just now Christ is the mediator. In the Old Testament, mediators came and they lived and they died and they were gone. In the New Testament, and particularly through the Ascension, forthcoming book coming probably August, but never mind, Christ is the mediator for all time for his people at the right hand of God, and we're saved through faith with him. So absolutely, the relationship with God is still assured through a mediator and through relationships with our mediator, Jesus, and through God, through trusting God in the same way that Abraham did. The Jewish law on its own isn't enough. And that's very clear in Paul in the book of Romans, is saying, no, we're not under law. If the law had been enough, you wouldn't have needed a new covenant with a new mediator. But that didn't negate the role of the law as being a people marker outer. Jesus himself says that there will not be one dot or tittle of the law will pass away. But that law, which is in the Old Testament, is the law for the people of Israel. It's not the law for other peoples. We are other peoples who've been allowed into our relationship with God through the same mediator. We have the trust and the faith. But in a sense, we as other nations are marked out by being nations with the same law. Why are we United Kingdom? Because we're the people who have the king as our king, and we have this rule of law, which is the British law. Why is France France, and so on? It's quite a key marker out of nationhood, and it's exactly the same thing as originally Israel was marked out, by being that people with that law. They also had the land and they also had the temple as other things to mark them out. In a sense, the people of Great Britain have the king, the British law, and this bit of land. Although, as you'll see through the history of Great Britain, it's been different bits of land over time. That's the way it goes. So, God wants all the nations with their own law systems to be relating to him.
Interesting. And you mentioned St. Paul there. And of course, St. Paul, the letters of his that we have, so often he's been called upon, isn't he, to make rulings, to be, as it were, a judge, to sort out the disputes. And then we refer back to Paul's rulings again and again through the history of the church ever since. We all read his letters. We all try to apply his rulings to our situation. It's a kind of common law there, isn't it? Returning back to that wisdom and applying it to new situations. And but we're being very theological, Moira. We're about halfway through the first part that we're recording here, and I think we should think about some of the more practical aspects of why we have law in the church. What springs to mind to you when we think of the practical side of why we need law?
I think there's a few other reasons. One is to do with human capacity in relationships. I don't know if you ever noticed, but if you're a group of 5 or 6 people, you can, among yourselves, sort of work out basically how we do things around here. And even if someone leaves and someone else comes, it's fairly easy for them to work out how we do things around here. Get much beyond 12 people, and you need some sort of structure in place as to how people relate to each other. The smaller the group of people, the less structure you need. The bigger the group of people, the more you need a structure. So, for example, in a country, if you were on a small island and there were only a dozen of you, it probably wouldn't be that much of an issue which side of the road you drove on. You could adjust as you met each other. But as soon as you need anything bigger than that, you actually need an agreement. We are all going to drive on the left or on the right, and you need some way of enforcing that. The more people you have trying to relate to each other, the more important it is to have some sort of agreement. And there seems to be something within the human psyche which says we can manage about 150 relationships on a personal human way. It's more or less than that, but that's the figure that people who've looked at these sort of things come across. Robin Dunbar is one of the anthropologists who's come up with this number. And if you want to read his book, How Many Friends Does a Person Need, where he talks about Dunbar's number, I think it's fascinating. We just cannot manage more direct relationships than that. So human groups grew beyond that structure have two options. One is you go with a strong man who at any point decides what the rules are going to be and lays them down. And that, historically, we've seen a lot. So in England, we had the kings. We had the Norman conquest. You still have the kings. And whoever is making a judge is doing it on, judgments are doing it on behalf of the king because he can't be everywhere. But up to a certain point, that the king could change what he was choosing to say was going to be the rules. In this country, we've got to the point where people realise that that has an arbitrary nature to it. What if you have an unjust king? And so we have the history of King John, Runnymede, the Magna Carta, where even the king has to accept some agreement on rules which are going to be accepted. And then over history, you can see how that's adapted itself. So in this country, we have a ruling council who advise the king, and we're now in a position where the king signs into law whatever that ruling council advises him. We call the ruling council Parliament. You could have called it something else. That's what it's called in the UK. So we both have that human reason, but then that has worked itself out into historical reasons. And within the church, it's fascinating. If you go to the oldest records we've got, including the meeting in Nicaea, which is, if Bede got his numbering right on dating, is 1699 years ago, and we'll be celebrating it next year. A part of that council was also some canons. You can Google the canons. Some of them still affect us today. So if a bishop's going to be agreed and consecrated, you have to have 3 bishops of a province there. And that's still something that's played through. Others of them aren't still so relevant. So the first canon of Nicaea is to do with what happens if a man's been castrated, or if he gets castrated, whether he can remain a priest or not. It doesn't seem to be a particular issue for us today. And there's some others of the canons where you'll see that actually, even if it were still something that was relevant, so there's one of the canons is about usury, and about if a priest lends money at interest. Now we're quite happy for priests to have mortgages, or vice versa, to have savings. So law has been there from very early on in the church, but it's been changed and adapted as time goes by. And one final practical reason, this is something I talk to church wardens about, is certainly things like the faculty jurisdiction is there to try and stop you messing things up for your successors. I say to them, if you could F things up for your successor by doing this, you need a faculty. It may not be very polite, but I hope they remember it. There are rules about what you can do to ancient buildings. And the number of times I've been to people and they say, look, actually, we've got to replace the mortar because they used the wrong mortar. And I say, no, you don't just put holes in the walls of ancient buildings because it will affect them. It could mess things up for your successors. So it's part of actually our love for our neighbours that we have law.
And that's what's characteristic of law as opposed to the more arbitrary systems you mentioned, isn't it? That there is consistency, there's openness, people are aware what the law is, there's fairness, we hope, and that's what makes law appropriate to these larger communities, I suppose, that you talk about. You need those characteristics, and we haven't really found any other methods of running those larger communities that I'm aware of, that to avoid arbitrariness and to be fair and open and consistent, that don't involve law.
Indeed. So in summary, the Church of England is big.
Mm.
We may only have about 700,000 regular worshippers each Sunday. That's still an awful lot of people. There's still more people than go to Premier League matches during the season. And it's a lot of people to relate to each other. You add in those who come at Christmas and Easter, you add in those who think it's their church even though they don't come. It's a lot of people. Those with the right to have people who are dead, buried in the churchyard. It's a lot of people. And you actually need something that is agreed on as a way of organising those relationships and those interplays of what people want to do. And that's really what law is about.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Moira.